Welcome to your deep dive, and a special welcome to anyone joining us from the F1 Blog's YouTube channel. You guys flagged some really interesting commentary about the Japanese Grand Prix, and today, well, our mission is to unpack that analysis, pull out some of the most insightful nuggets, and figure out what this race really tells us.
Absolutely. Yeah, the F1 Blog's commentary really zooms in on Max Verstappen, Red Bull's performance, the strategic decisions or maybe the missed opportunities from McLaren, and the overall feeling that the race itself, well, it wasn't exactly a thriller. They also pointed out some interesting things about the other teams and drivers, definitely worth exploring.
Yeah, for sure. So let's get into it. And it seems like F1 Blogs thinks the best place to start is by looking at Max Verstappen's victory through this lens of Kotowari.
What's really fascinating here is F1 Blogs bringing up Kotowari. This Japanese cultural concept, kind of like an obsessive dedication to perfection in even the smallest details. They argue that Verstappen really embodied this spirit at Suzuka, securing his fourth win in a row at this track. Now, thinking about Verstappen's approach to a race weekend, even in practice sessions, does this idea of striving for absolute perfection in every single aspect resonate with what we've seen from him throughout his career beyond just this one race?
It's a very interesting idea. F1 Blogs really emphasizes Verstappen's ability to squeeze out the absolute maximum performance even when things weren't going perfectly smoothly, and this laser focus across the entire weekend. It sounds like his pole position was particularly important, setting him up for this victory.
Precisely. Even though McLaren seemed to have the fastest individual sectors during qualifying, Verstappen managed to put together his very best mini sectors on that crucial lap. F1 Blogs calls it a masterpiece, pointing out how Verstappen was wrestling this car that they describe as right on the edge, a wild animal, and yet he still managed to grab that pole position. So McLaren showed raw speed in those individual sectors, but Verstappen's ability to string together a perfect lap really highlights that balance between car performance and, obviously, driver skill in qualifying.
Do you think F1 Blogs maybe dives into whether McLaren's setup might have favored those individual sector times at the cost of, overall lap consistency?
Yeah, that's a good question. And even with McLaren's apparent pace advantage and Suzuka being notoriously difficult for overtaking, Verstappen managed to stay ahead the entire race. That pole position also marked a pretty significant milestone in his career. Absolutely. It was his 41st career pole position. He achieved it at the very same circuit where Ayrton Senna also hit that number. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, even though Red Bull is only third in the Constructors' Championship right now, and remarkably, every single point they've scored comes from Verstappen alone. He's now just a single point behind the leader in the drivers' standings. That's after 3 races and the sprint. This really emphasizes how much a great driver can influence a team's overall performance, don't you think?
And here's where it gets really interesting, at least according to F1 Blogs. Their analysis then shifts to McLaren's strategy. And, well, the commentator doesn't exactly hold back with the criticism.
You're right. They seem genuinely surprised, even a bit disappointed, by McLaren's apparent lack of what they call courage, not trying something different with Lando Norris's strategy. F1 Blogs argues pretty strongly that McLaren basically copying Verstappen's strategy was a big mistake because it pretty much guaranteed they'd stay behind him the whole race.
It seems like their argument hinges on the idea that McLaren and Norris might be taking a long-term view, focusing on the championship as a whole. But they say there are some serious risks with that.
Yeah, it raises a big question about what if Red Bull develops their car further? Or what if teams like Ferrari or Mercedes close the gap in the next races? F1 Blogs even goes so far as to suggest that right now, Red Bull is only the 4th fastest car, and that it's Verstappen's incredible driving that's hiding that fact. If Red Bull finds more pace, the whole game could change. They don't really provide specific evidence for this 4th fastest claim, but it definitely makes you think.
And F1 Blogs isn't afraid to make comparisons to past situations. Specifically, they mentioned Fernando Alonso's 2010 and 2012 seasons. Can you explain that connection?
Sure. The commentator highlights the risk for McLaren. They might look back and regret these missed opportunities if they don't take advantage of what F1 Blog sees as their current edge, however slight. The comparison to Alonso, who was often in the championship fight even when his car wasn't the absolute fastest, suggests that grabbing every chance is crucial. F1 Blogs also notes that Lando Norris never even got within DRS range of Verstappen. Unlike Piastri, who seemed to have similar or even better pace at times, that's a big strategic misstep in their view. Just a reminder for those who might not know, DRS, or the drag reduction system, lets the rear wing open on certain parts of the track when a driver is within a second of the car ahead. It gives them a big speed boost to help with overtaking.
So what does all this say about the race itself? F1 Blogs doesn't exactly make it sound very exciting.
No, they don't. F1 Blogs describes it pretty bluntly as boring, and even uses the word truño. That's a pretty harsh assessment. There wasn't much change in the top 10 after the first lap. Lewis Hamilton overtaking Nico Hülkenberg was about the only exception early on, so yeah, it supports their view.
And it seems like one of the main reasons for this lack of action was that almost everyone went for a one-stop strategy.
Exactly. The tires didn't degrade much on the new asphalt at Suzuka, so most drivers could comfortably do the whole race with just one pit stop. And then you add in the fact that there were no safety cars, no virtual safety cars, no retirements, no accidents, not even the yellow flag. It really limited the chances for strategic variation for those shakeups in the order that we usually see in Formula One. The fact that they could manage a one-stop points to that low tire degradation, which probably comes down to the track surface and the specific tires Pirelli brought. F1 Blogs doesn't explicitly say it, but it makes you wonder, could a different tire choice have made things more strategic?
F1 Blogs also raises a point about whether this particular track really let us see the true performance of each team.
Right. They suggest that some cars, which might actually be faster, got stuck behind slower ones, so they couldn't show their true pace. It reinforces how important track position is, the position you get in qualifying on Saturday. They say that if McLaren had gotten Norris or Piastri on pole, the whole race could have been completely different.
Okay, let's shift gears to some of the observations F1 Blogs made about other drivers and teams. They were, shall we say, not very complimentary about Charles Leclerc's performance for Ferrari.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that even though Leclerc finished fourth, F1 Blogs calls him invisible. They even go on to suggest that Ferrari might actually be the fourth fastest team right now, which maybe explains why his race was so quiet, no real battles or anything exciting.
And how about Mercedes? F1 Blogs has an interesting take on how they compare to McLaren.
They say that Mercedes is the closest team to McLaren in terms of overall performance. But Lewis Hamilton himself admitted he wasn't at his best all weekend. He couldn't match his teammates, George Russell's, pace. The commentator even says this makes their strong qualifying performance on Saturday seem a little unreal looking back.
It's always cool to see how the rookie drivers do, and F1 Blogs picks out a couple for praise after this race.
Yeah, they highlight Kevin Antonelli as the top rookie of the weekend, showing some real promise. He kept closing the gap to George Russell throughout the race. F1 Blogs even says that in the later stages, Antonelli was matching Russell for pace, although team orders probably stopped him from actually overtaking. Isaac Hadjar, driving for RB, also gets a shout-out. He was the second-best Red Bull driver for the second Grand Prix in a row, which is pretty impressive considering he's still relatively inexperienced at this level of F1.
At the other end of the spectrum, Nico Hülkenberg managed to score some points for Haas.
Yeah, and that's seen as a good thing for Haas because they were one of the few teams that brought upgrades to this race. And it seems like those upgrades actually worked. F1 Blogs specifically mentions that Hülkenberg outperformed his teammate.
And Alex Albon kept his point streak going for Williams, even though he wasn't totally happy with how his own race went.
Exactly. He reportedly had some disagreements with his race engineer about strategy during the race. But still, his ability to consistently score points for Williams is valuable. F1 Blogs also talks about Carlos Sainz Jr. He had a grid penalty from qualifying but managed some good overtakes and said he was feeling more comfortable in the car, especially looking ahead to Bahrain, a track where he's historically been strong.
Then the analysis turns to the RB drivers, Yuki Tsunoda and Isaac Hadjar. Tsunoda looked promising in qualifying, but maybe had a less impressive race.
Yeah, Tsunoda showed good pace in qualifying. He made it to Q2. But then a mistake in that session cost him a potential top 10 starting position. He did get voted driver of the day by the fans, which F1 Blogs finds a little odd. They suggest the bigger issue at Red Bull might be the car's performance, not the driver's.
How about Alpine? Sounds like another tough weekend for them.
Unfortunately, yeah. Pierre Gasly finished outside the points. So Alpine's still stuck at 0 points for the season. F1 Blogs also brings up Jack Doohan's expensive crash during practice. They highlight the potential cost, maybe even for Doohan's future with the team. They even speculate about a swap with another driver, Franco Colapinto. Doohan seems to have bounced back mentally, but his race was pretty uneventful.
Fernando Alonso just barely made it into the points, finishing 10th. F1 Blog's assessment of AstonMartin is pretty harsh.
They call Alonso's 10th place a miracle, given how they see the Aston Martin car. F1 Blog says it's slow everywhere, especially on the straights. And not that different from last year's car. They say Aston Martin needs some serious upgrades to change things. Lance Stroll finishing last definitely highlights the struggles they're facing.
Finally, looking ahead, F1 Blogs has a couple of key takeaways for the future.
Because the race was so uneventful, F1 Blogs suggests that Pirelli, the tire supplier, should think about bringing softer tires to Suzuka next year. The idea is that softer tires would lead to more pit stops, more strategic variety, and hopefully a more exciting race. They also point out that the next races in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia are coming up quickly. Not much time for teams to celebrate or dwell on anything from Japan.
So wrapping up our deep dive into F1 Blog's analysis of the Japanese Grand Prix, what are the biggest things that stand out to you? We saw Verstappen dominate, but it makes you wonder about Red Bull's car and whether McLaren made the right strategic choices. The race itself wasn't very exciting, which leads to discussions about tire choices and Suzuka's layout.
Definitely. And the performances of rookies like Kevin Antonelli and Isaac Hadjar give us a glimpse of the talent coming up. Meanwhile, teams like Alpine are struggling, and the contrasting fortunes of the Spanish drivers Alonso and Sainz add to the storylines we're following this season.
Here's something to consider. F1 Blog suggests that Red Bull might only be the fourth fastest car. So how much of Verstappen's success do you think comes from his amazing driving versus the car itself? And what strategic changes should McLaren make to actually fight for wins? This race has given us a lot to think about as the championship unfolds.
And one last thought, especially for our listeners from F1 Blogs. The commentator was really critical of how little action there was on track. What one change, maybe to the F1 rules or even the Suzuka track design, do you think would create more exciting and unpredictable races? Something to ponder as we look ahead to the next Grand Prix. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the latest F1 news and analysis, remember to subscribe to the F1 Blogs YouTube channel. They've got more great commentary updates throughout the season.